Thank you very much. Again, I would like to thank Rastko and Peter very much for the invitation. We had a wonderful discussion yesterday, and I learned a lot from you, and I greatly enjoyed our discussions, and I'm looking forward to a continuation now and in the future. I announced a talk on joint attention. Now it's on joint intention. Attention is a mode, a form of intentionality. Intention is the paradigm of the current debate on collective intentionality. So whatever I'm going to say about joint intention also applies to joint attention. I'm covering the topic that I announced, but I'm going to be a bit broader in the analysis. And I'm doing so because I want to introduce to you what has been on my mind for 15 years now, and I think it's the most important thing I have to say to you, and I'm looking forward to your objections and comments. So there is this thing that's called shared, joint, or collective intention. And there are different names for it. I use these terms interchangeably. Some authors make distinctions between shared and collective intention, but I use the terms interchangeably. And it is generally acknowledged to be very important for the understanding of the social world. Many authors assume that if we are going to understand anything about social facts and sociality in general, we've got to understand what it means for people to act together. And in order to understand what it means for people to act together intentionally, we've got to understand what it means for people to share an intention. And most everybody agrees in the current debate that there is this phenomenon that's of the form we intend to phi. Now the phi stands for an action, and the phi is printed in green here because it is collective rather than distributive. And this is a very important distinction that has not been analyzed sufficiently in the metaphysical literature. I would like for metaphysicians to turn their attention to the distinction between distribution and collection. But there is an intuitive way of grasping the distinction. So what we're interested in is the case in which we intend to phi is such that the phi is one token action. So there is a distributive sense of we intend to phi, for example, in the case in which we intend to drink a coffee, right? In that case, each of us intends to drink a coffee. This is different from the case in which Rastko and I intend to dance a tango together. In this case, it's not that Rastko intends to dance a tango and I intend to dance a tango, but there is one token dancing of the tango which Rastko and I jointly intend to perform. So the interesting case is where we intend to phi is of one token action with many agents. It's not a distribution, it's not many actions which we intend to perform, but one token action in which we jointly intend to engage together. So that's the thing we want to understand. What's that phenomenon of intentionality that's of the form we intend to phi, where the phi is one token action. Now, there is this well-established distinction where intentionality is concerned, right? Intentionality always has a content, it has a mode, and it has a subject, right? That's what intentionality is. It is directed at a content, it is of a certain mode, and it has a subject. And in our case, obviously the content is the phi, the mode is the intent, and the subject is the we. Now the big question, and this is basically where everybody agrees in the literature, right? We want to understand this phenomenon, we have this distinction between distribution and collection, and we have subject, mode, and content. Now this is as far as agreement goes, and now comes the big disagreement in the current literature, where how to understand we intend to phi, where the phi is collective. Now, content accounts, I distinguish between content accounts, subject accounts, and mode accounts of collective intentionality. And content accounts say, well, you know, we intend to phi, where the phi is collective. It's just the case that each of us intends that collective action. So the collective element is just in the content, whereas the we, the subject, is distributive. So if Rasko and I intend to dance a tango together, I intend to dance a tango together, and Rasko intends to dance a tango together. Rasko, you'll have to protest if the example is not to you, does not conform to your preferences. I can easily change. So, that's it, you know, and there is Occam's razor, and this is a nice and smooth analysis. Of course, it's not enough for Rasko to intend to dance a tango together with me, and me to intend to dance a tango together with Rasko. There's got to be a structure of mutual knowledge, right? It cannot be that unbeknownst to each other we have this intention. So we have to add a structure of mutual knowledge or common knowledge between us, and we end up basically with something along Michael Bratman's analysis of shared cooperative activity. And that's all fine, but it has problems. And the problem is that there are restrictions to objects of intention. You can intend only what you take yourself to be able, at least in principle, to do. So intention is action referential. What you intend is basically an action. There's this bit of discussion about propositional intention, but I'm skipping that here for the sake of brevity. Intention is of action. The object of intention is an action, and it can only be your own action. I can intend to make it the case that you act. That I can intend, but I cannot intend your acting. I can only intend my making it the case, that's my action, that you act. Intention, insofar as it is action referential, is action self-referential. You can intend only your own actions. Now, our dancing a tango is not my action. It's not something I can do. So I can't intend it. Therefore, the content analysis is based on impossible individual intentions. Nobody, neither Rastko nor I, distributively, can intend our dancing together, because this is not something I can do. It's not something Rastko can do either. Thereby neither I nor Rastko distributively can intend it. Right? If that's true, and I believe it is, then the easiest way to go is to say, yeah, well, if neither Rastko nor I distributively can intend our dancing a tango, because it's not something I or Rastko can do. Maybe we can. So the idea behind the subject account is based on the insight that intention is action self-referential, meaning that the subject of the intention and the agent of the intended action have to be the same. The insight then is, the move is to say, well, if the action is collective, the subject has to be collective too. It's not the case that when Rastko and I intend to dance a tango together, he and I distributively intend to dance a tango together, but rather that we collectively, we together, intend to dance a tango together. That's the basic idea, and it follows rather straightforwardly from the big problem of the content account. And I think it's right. It's the right analysis, but it is a bit maybe spooky, because who is that we together? Have you met him, the we together? Because there's Rastko and there is I, right? But is there this together thing? Who is that together thing? Who is that subject? Who is the we? And we recall some, rhetoric from times we don't like to remember, invoking collective subjects, the people, something along these lines. And this seems to invoke, fears of collectivism. So it seems that there is an issue here concerning the identity of the subject, right? There is no such thing as the we. In the case in which Rastko and I dance a tango together, there are two subjects, right? Rastko and I. It's not the case that there are three subjects. It's not the case that there is Rastko, there is me, and there is the we. It's not the case. So, this green we is a bit, we have to be able to say something about that. Now, this fear of the collective subject drove many authors, among them perhaps most prominently Raimo Tuomila, but many authors along with him, to what is called mode accounts. These are the we moders, I call them. And they say, well, actually the right analysis is, let's keep that we distributive. But because of course content accounts are insufficient, we've got to put something collective somewhere in the analysis. So let's put it in the mode. So we distributively, we collectively intend. There's a mode of intention, there's this we mode. And then there is the content that's collective. We mode, a very prominent word. And by the way, it's not only Tuomila who does this. It has already been initiated at the very beginning of the current debate on collective intentionality by Wilfried Sellers. This is basically, he thinks, oh, well, we is spooky, so let's put it in the mode, we intention. And that's mode-like. Maybe also Searle seems to have something along these lines in mind when he says that, there are individuals, but they have this intentionality of the we form in their heads. He doesn't use the word mode, but he calls it a form, but I guess he's very close to endorsing a we mode account. Now, I have several things to say here. Let's be brief. What's a mode? A mode is what distinguishes a case of fear from a case of desire. So fear and desire are intentional modes, as are belief, intention, etc. These are all modes. Now, we and I obviously do not belong to this list of modes. They are not modes. Furthermore, what does an intentional mode modify? What does the distinction between fear and hope, or fear and belief, what's modified there? It's the formal object. It's whether you perceive something as dangerous or something, the same thing maybe, as to be looked forward to. Either you fear it or you hope for it. If it's perceived as good, you hope for it. If it's perceived as dangerous, you fear it. And the element of being dangerous or of being looked forward to, that's obviously in the content. So usually modes modify the content. Now, what does we or I modify? Not content. Because we can fear something together, or we can hope. Obviously, this is not a distinction, not a difference in the content, but rather it is a difference in the subject. Now, this mode, if it is a mode, modifies the subject. So maybe it is a subject. Here are my claims for today, and I've got to speed up a little bit, because I have only 1 hour, right? Or how long do you want me to talk? Okay, you tell me 5 minutes before you want me to stop. So here are my claims. An adequate account of collective intentionality is a subject account. And plural subject theory needs an adequate account of subjectivity, and that hasn't been provided by the literature. Especially not by the one author who for a certain time claimed to endorse a subject account, Margaret Gilbert. She's right, I think. She was right when she endorsed the subject account. She doesn't use the label anymore, but she did not have an adequate concept of subjectivity, and we need that. And then, thirdly, let me address the worry, the we. And my argument is going to be, well, this is just a mistaken conception of subjectivity that should raise the very same fears in the individual case. So it's not specific to the collective case, to the plural case. It should already worry you. The same worries you should have with regards to the I. Who is that I? Have you ever met your I, or somebody else's I? The same worries that we should have against substantifying or reifying the subject are now coming up again concerning the we. But the right way of addressing them is not by shying away from a subject account, but by understanding subjectivity in the right way. So, my strategy is, I want to now just in very general terms discuss the concept of the subject of intention. So how is it? Think of an intention you have. Maybe you want to meet friends tonight or something like that. How is that intention yours? What about that intention makes it your intention? And one obvious way of approaching this issue is by means of analyzing the way in which you know it is yours. So, and it is well established in the literature that the way you know an intention is yours, your own, differs from the way you know about anybody else's intention. It is knowledge of a special kind, and I'm using, such a wide variety of current literature addresses this special kind of knowledge thing concerning self-knowledge that I mention here, different terms that are used in the literature to capture the difference that's at stake here. So some authors who follow on Enscombian tracks call it groundless knowledge. It is knowledge without evidence. you know what you intend, and you don't know it by looking in the mirror, you know it just like that. There is this immediacy of self-knowledge. Immediacy is also a term that's often used. It's non-observational, it is they say, and I often use the term pre-reflective self-knowledge, self-consciousness, self-awareness. I use all these terms interchangeably because I think what all of these authors were driving at is basically the same thing. So, and now if that's true of the way in which your singular individual intentions are yours, the question concerning the subjectivity of collective intentions is this. How does this carry over to we intend? Are we the subject of we intend in the same sense in which I am the subject of I intend? That's the most straightforward way of asking the question concerning the subject of collective intention. And frankly, I'm a bit surprised nobody has asked the question in this way as yet. And I think it's about time to, ask the question in a straightforward manner. So the question is, if we are the subject of we intend in the same sense in which I am the subject of I intend, and if the way in which I am the subject of I intend is by means of this groundless, immediate, pre-reflective self-knowledge, self-consciousness, self-awareness, the question obviously is there such a thing as genuine, immediate, non-reflective, non-observational, groundless group self-knowledge, collective self-consciousness, plural self-awareness? And if there are genuine plural subjects, and if there is no such group self-knowledge, there are no plural subjects. And let's accept this. If the result of this analysis is that it doesn't work in the same way, let's just forget about plural subjects. So this is how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to say a word on how I intend is self-known. And then I'm going to play the devil's advocate by pointing out differences between the singular and the plural case, and then I'm going to conclude by defending the plural subject. I want to argue that we find all of these functions that we find connected to self-knowledge, we find it in the plural case as well, though we should not be surprised that the plural subject differs from the singular subject. And if I have a take-home message, it is this: the we is no collective I. So it's not that singular subjectivity can be collectivized to understand the way in which we are subjects. Rather, singular subjectivity and plural subjectivity are variants of subjectivity in general. And it is a mistake of the history of philosophy to think of subjectivity always in singular terms. Descartes should have addressed the issue of the cogitamus alongside the cogito. Instead, he limited the analysis to the cogito, the singular, and later authors tended to think that the cogitamus is just a collective cogito. For example, in Rousseau's an author which I very much like, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and his concept of the moi commun, the collective I, the communal I. And that's a big mistake. Once you think that plural subjects are centered in the same way your singular subjectivity is, you're going to think that you actually are the plural subject, and you're going to act in the administration of the bien public accordingly. You know, there is the connection between subjectivity and violence. I bought a book this morning with the title Subjectivity and Violence, and I think this is related to the issue here, what I'm going to say. So let's first focus on the singular. And let me address the question of one way of approaching self-knowledge is, and self-consciousness, self-awareness, that special kind of knowledge which we have of ourselves and only of ourselves. We know of ourselves in a way in which we know about nothing else. And that's what makes us subjects. And how am I going to defend this claim? By pointing out some functions which that sort of knowledge has. What does it do in mind? And I have 4 functions here. And what I'm trying to do here is just, gather a vast amount of literature on, first-person perspective, subjectivity, self-knowledge, and see what authors are writing about. I'm not trying to be partisan here. I'm reading the literature and I'm taking everything that seems to be plausible to me and I'm listing it. And I'm putting it in a certain order, but maybe it could be rearranged. Frankly, I must admit, it starts a little, I think it's a developmental story. It starts with self-identification and it ends with self-authorization. But maybe I'm wrong here. I don't want to make a developmental claim here, but I want to capture whatever clear ideas there are in the literature. So the first issue is self-identification. So knowledge of the form I intend secures its own standpoint. It is immune against challenges concerning the identity of the intender. So if I'm aware of my intention, if I intend is known, is self-known by me, then there is no question about whom I'm thinking about. It's I, right? And you cannot challenge me by saying, well, whom do you mean by I? I is I. It's not open to challenges. Meaning, and that's a small thing, but it is quite remarkable. And modern philosophy generally thought it is a big thing. And I'm afraid to say that many authors have tried to make way too much of it, right? Like Hegel, who thinks that, self-knowledge, once you understand it, you understand the structure of the cosmos. I think this is totally mistaken, but it is still remarkable. It is something quite unique that there should be mind, that in mind, in virtue of its being self-known, it secures its own standpoint. It self-constitutes the identity of the intender. And I think we should leave it at that, because if you want to pack more into it, then we're off track. But let's focus on that basic thing. And it concerns just identification, not predication. That's where all the nonsense starts. If you think that just because I intend secures the I, it also secures the intent. So, and that's not just identification, but predication. I think that's wrong. I may mistake what I think to be what really is just, I don't know, a momentary impulse for an intention. Right? We're sometimes in error about the nature of our own attitudes. And clearly that's clearly not Descartes' idea, right? He wanted the predication as well, but I don't think that's true. Sometimes we're confused about the sort of attitudes we have. But even if we are confused concerning or in error concerning predication, we are still correct, in inverted commas, concerning identification. So that's the thing we should hold on to. That's the whole thing in, Descartes and all of these authors, Fichte, Husserl, that's true. Second, self-validation. Even though I grant that we're sometimes in error concerning the nature of our own intentional states, such as in the frequent case in which we mix up temporary infatuation with real love, right? We can be in error about our own attitudes. But even if that's granted, if we know just like that. We know without evidence. So let's not make the error of thinking that if we grant fallibility in predication, the normal way in which we know cannot be of the immediate kind. And let's not make the mistake of thinking of immediacy concerning validation in terms of infallibility. So if we know just like that. We don't have to look into the mirror to find out what it is we want. We know it just like that. And that's obviously compatible with the case in which we are in error, right? Other people may tell us, well, you're not really in love, you're just temporarily infatuated, and sometimes we have to grant that, right? But insofar as we know just like that, without observation. And that's quite remarkable. Third, it is in virtue of attitudes being self-known that they are commitments. We are now turning to the commitment issue. Gilbert just takes it as basic and has a very rough concept of commitment. I want to take it a bit deeper here. So let's think about this. How is it that what you want, how is it that what you intend commits you to action? It's obviously not the case that whenever you have an intention, for you to act, you need to have a further motivation, namely the desire to act on your intention. Because if this were the case, you would need a further motivation to act on the motivation for your intention. You need to have a desire to do what you intend. Right? That cannot be the case. The motivation, the intention closes a motivational gap. Intention commits you to act without a further motivation. And that closure of the motivational gap is the working of self-knowledge. It's because the intention is yours that it commits you to act. So this blocks challenges, self-knowledge blocks challenges of the form, well, I intend, but why should I care about my intentions? So do I have a desire to act on my intention? If that's your attitude, you don't intend. Right? If you've got to think, well, okay, I've got this intention, but do I want to act on it? Then you don't intend. Then you have just a proposition in mind. That's not the same as intending. And fourth, and ultimately, there is self-authorization. That's whole literature, Richard Morin, and all of these people, which I want to pack into the story here. So normally, I mean, in many cases, your friends know better what it is you really like and what it is you really believe, right? That happens. But our social practices would be very different if this were the normal case. Because then my paper would have, Rasko would have to present my paper because he knows better what I think than I do, right? That would be a very different society. In our society, there is the author's privilege, whoever intends or believes is in the best position, is usually, not infallibly, but usually in the best position to say what it is he or she intends or believes. And one way of cashing this out is, it's the guy who made up his or her mind. It's the maker's privilege we have. I know best because I made up my mind. There's this activist conception of the mind here. Now, I think this is all true, and I want to invite you to think favorably about these functions. And I want to suggest that, okay, there are some more stories we would have to tell concerning, horizontal awareness and perception and so on, but it is basically a big chunk, important feature of what it means to be a subject. All right, that's these functions constitute what we understand by a subject of attitudes. And these functions work by means of self-knowledge. So if you accept that, as I invite you to do, and I really believe it, and I would be quite devastated if you would convince me that all of this, or even some parts of it, are not true. If that's the subject of intention, let's now turn to the collective, the plural case. If we intend is subjective in the same way, it has to be self-known. So let's see, does we intend self-identify, self-validate, self-commit, and self-authorize? Does it or does it not? That's the question concerning plural subjects. I mean, if it does not, we may still talk of plural subject. We may talk of plural subject in the way Margaret Gilbert does in her latest book, a book in which I browsed the book, about 83 times she uses the word emulate a plural subject. Emulate a body, a unified body. So she's not committed anymore to the view that there are plural subjects. She's committed to the view that there are emulations of plural subjects. And that's a difference. The real thing and the emulation thereof are two different things, and Margaret Gilbert is not committed to the real thing. So let's look at identification. We said that I intend leaves no room for the question, who am I thinking about? The identity of the agent comes with the thought. And it does not pick out, represent an agent. I mean, there's a whole story to tell about Wittgenstein, subject use of I, and I didn't go into this, but I said that it cannot misidentify, right? And thus I intend where it is self-known, self-identifies. So how does this work in the plural case? We intend. Is the identity of us, our identity, clear in mind of the form we intend in the same way as it is in mind of the form I intend? Obviously not. It is in need of an answer to the question, who am I thinking about? The identity of one's partners does not seem to come with a thought. So if I say I intend to fly home tonight, you're not going to ask me, well, whom are you talking about, right? But if I say we intend to fly to Vienna tonight, you're very likely to going to ask, well, whom do you mean, right? It's not just me, it's got to be somebody else also, but who, right? That doesn't come with the form of thought with which I'm presenting you. So, and it obviously picks out or represents agents. That's the Wittgenstein thing, and it misidentifies rather easily, right? I thought that we intended to fly to Vienna, but I was mistaken. It wasn't Rasko, it was Peter, or maybe nobody at all, just me. I can be wrong, right? Validation. We said that knowledge of what it is I intend is not in need of observational evidence. We know it when we know it, if we know it just like that. Now, how does this work in the plural case? It doesn't work at all, because knowledge of what it is we intend needs observational support. So if I say, well, Rasko and I intend to dance a tango together, you're going to ask me, well, you know Rasko, you're going to ask me, how do you know? And I better be in a position to tell you, well, Rasko and I agreed on it, for example. And that's recollection. And that's observational evidence, right? So I can't say, well, it is known just like that, right? It is not self-validating. And I have a piece here on this wonderful shoemaker stuff, but I've got to skip it. Now let's look at commitment. And this is very important to me because it's sort of the connection to normative issues. So we said that I intend commits to action without additional motivation. I can simply not care about what it is I intend, as not caring destroys the intention. And let me add here, if I have a minute, that one way of elucidating this is, so this is the way in which the content of intention and content of cognition becomes normative, because it is in virtue of our intentions and cognitions being self-known that intention has to be under the guise of the good. In the same way, cognition has to be or is placed under the guise of truth. So self-knowledge places theoretical attitudes under the guise of truth and practical attitudes under the guise of the good. The attitude, it is bad under any description, but I intend it, is paradoxical in the same way as it is true, but I don't believe it, right? Moore's paradox, right? So what's wrong about Moore's paradox? It's nothing logically inconsistent. It is possible that it's true, because there are many things that are true that I don't believe, right? It's possible, it's even frequent. But it is in virtue of my beliefs being self-known, that my beliefs are my commitments, and my commitment to believing or not believing is in contradiction in Moore's paradox. So if it is true, it is there. If it's acknowledged by me to be true, it is believed, right? It's because I cannot not care about what it is I believe that my statement that it's true commits me to believe. And thus the contradiction, the paradox in Moore's paradox. And the same is true for the practical case. It is bad under any description, but I intend it. It's the very same contradiction, the very same paradox. Now this is wonderful because it makes us a subject, right? It makes us pursuers of the good and pursuers of truth in virtue of self-knowledge. It's quite remarkable. It's a good thing. But does it work in the plural? So we intend does not commit to action in the way I intend does. I often do not, and indeed sometimes should not care about what I know we intend. And this does not destroy our intentions. For example, I tell you what we intend in Vienna, we being the philosophy department of the University of Vienna. And you wouldn't believe what it is we intend. We intend horrible things. Bad under any description. You know, it's really bad, and I should not care about it, but it's what we intend. You know, it's not up to me. It's our intention, so, and it can be very bad, and it's not a paradox for me to say it is bad under any description, but we intend it. It's very often a reasonable position, because I'm the dissenter. I'm a member of the philosophy department, and I tell you it is bad under any description. Doesn't put me in the place of in a paradoxical attitude. Rather, you might think that I'm being quite a reasonable subject to think in these terms. So there's an obvious difference, and it seems likely to assume now that if we define self-commitment by an attitude being self-known, constituting that attitude as a commitment, we do not find the same structure in the plural, and we conclude that we intend does not self-commit. And I have here a slide on the shoemaker thing, but let's skip this. I invite, somebody should write a paper on that, Moore's paradox in the plural and stuff. It's really, I highly advise you to write that paper, otherwise I'm going to write it. You've got to move quickly, because as soon as I have my current manuscript finished, I'm going to turn to this issue. Now here, authority. We said that I intend is not infallible predication-wise, but it privileges over observers. I might be mistaken, but I usually know best. And it comes with the authority of the maker of the attitude. Now let's look at we intend. It does not per se privilege over outside observers, because, you know, I'm telling you about what we, the philosophy department of the University of Vienna, intend. But I've been on a sabbatical for 4 months. But Rastko, he spent the last couple of weeks in Vienna, and he might be, even though he's not a member of the faculty, he might be in a better position to know what it is we intend than I. This is not unusual, right? It's quite normal. Why? Because he's in a better position to observe. And because knowledge of these attitudes depend on observational evidence. Right? So we intent does not self-authorize. So if that's true, I was playing the devil's advocate so far, and if that's true, let's just forget about plural subjects. And it is sad because you know, if content accounts are mistaken, and if mode accounts simply collapse into subject accounts and there is no subject of intention, I think the consequence, in all honesty, which we should draw, is that actions have to be individuated according to individuals. So there is no action, no token action, which we can ever perform together, because what I intend is my action, what you intend is your action, and of course these actions may combine. But there's never going to be a tango that's actually being performed together. It's just that my dancing tango-like and your dancing tango-like might mesh. That's the highest we get in action. There's never going to be one soccer game that's actually played together. There's never going to be one token soccer game, but just a suitably matched aggregate of actions. And you know, some authors in the current literature, they talk that way. You know, it always saddens me a little bit, because so much of what joins us is somehow lost in that description, right? If you want to hold on that, for example, when we talk together, there's really such a thing as a discussion. Not just you talking and I talking, but a discussion. If you want to hold on to this, you've got to find a way, you've got to solve the plural subject problem. So let's try. Let's overcome the objections we've made against attempts to identify the working of self-knowledge in plural action. And of course, the big problem can easily be stated in the following way. Okay, we said that self-knowledge constitutes the subject of intention. Now, in the plural case, the subject involves different people. How can people self-know each other? Right, it sounds like a paradox from the outset, right? It sounds like a non-starter. Of course, self-knowledge is just of me. I cannot self-know other people. It wouldn't be self-knowledge, right? Sounds like a straightforward, you know, futile attempt. But let's see. I have something to say here, and I must confess, I'm not equally sure in my defense in all four functions, but I'm going to try. And in some cases, I'm quite sure I'm right. In other cases, so we said that we intend does not presuppose. Yeah, we said that there is this problem that we intend seems to, be in the picking out business. There is no self-identification going on in we intend, but I have a two-pronged strategy here. First, a way of argumentation which has become a bit out of fashion, but which maybe has a certain force. I'm currently fascinated with medieval philosophy, and there is a lot of argumentation of that sort in medieval philosophy. It's appeal to authority. And we can find in authors who thought about joint or collective intention something like a pre-intentional sense of the other. That's Searle's way of putting it, and he hasn't elaborated it, but this is exactly what we mean. The idea that there is a sense of us at work in sharing attitudes that's pre-intentional, in that it is not the case that I have to first identify who's in and then form a plural intention, but a sense of us that comes with the plurality of the intention. Now, the second strategy is more promising, and I'm claiming here the following. What's really self-identifying about intentionality is first personality, not first person singularity. So I'm going to claim that there is a sense in which I intend can be mistaken because it's really we intend, in the same way in which we intend can be mistaken because it's really just I intend. So this is a companionship in guilt strategy. I'm arguing that it's actually not the singular that's self-identified, but just the first person that's identified. First person comes in a singular and in a plural. So, and here is my story. I'm going to illustrate this with a little story. Rastko and I, we had this wonderful discussion this morning, and we came up with, this is a hypothetical example. We haven't yet, but we could. We had this wonderful idea for a paper, right? Because Rastko was talking about his recent insights into early Fichte, and I thought this matches perfectly with what I'm doing in this domain, and we came up with an idea of a paper. And we're sure we're going to place it in, Philosophical Quarterly or Ethics or big journal. So there is this intention. We intend to write a paper together. A paper. It's one paper, two authors. Unfortunately for Rastko, I'm a bit egotistical or maybe autistical, so I'm going to travel home to Vienna, still thinking about the paper, and I'm just going to write it because it's a great paper. It has to be written, and I'm going to write it. And then in a couple of weeks, Rastko is going to call me up and ask me about the paper we intend to write. And I wrote it. It's done, Now what's the situation? Huh?
You will have done it in a couple of weeks.
Sure, what do you think? I mean, you cannot. Time is flying. Come on, this current philosophical industry of cranking out papers. You young people, you better speed up a little bit. You've got to increase your output, but seriously. I mean, what's that question about at all? So, what's the situation now? Is it the case? So, there are two descriptions. One is that actually, I mean, normatively, of course, Rastko is right. He should chastise me for just doing what we intended to do, right? And I'm not denying this, but I could, as an individualist, I could say, well, Rastko, normatively, Rastko asked me, what's with the paper we intend to write? And I could say, well, I'm very sorry, and I really wronged you, Rastko, but ontologically, you're mistaken, because there is no paper we intend to write. I intend to write it. No, it's now become the object of my intention. So normatively, you're right, but ontologically, you're making a mistake. I think this is wrong. I think the right description is that with a shock, I should realize that I was mistaken about the subject of intention. What I took to be my project is really our project. So I misidentified the subject of intention. I didn't misidentify it in a sense that involves anything beyond the first person, but I misidentified by taking it to be first personal in the singular when it is really first personal in the plural. So if only one story of that sort is true, we have now to revise our thinking about self-identification in a fundamental way. Self-identification works with regards to the first person, but it doesn't specify whether it's singular or plural. That would be a major advance in thinking about that feature on which so much ink has been spilled in philosophical research. What's about self-validation? You know what, let me skip that because time is flying. And I admit it's the weakest of my features. I have an argument here, read it up. Let's turn to self-commitment. So we said that I intend it, but it's utterly bad, is paradoxical. In virtue of my intention being self-known, it commits me to the good. It is under the guise of the good. And we said that nothing of the sort is true of the plural case. We intend it is utterly bad, but we intend it is not paradoxical, but often a very reasonable position to take. Think of the dissident. And I grant that, but I also think that it differs from the case where I'm completely non-committal towards any stranger's attitude, because even though it is utterly bad, but we intend it, is not a paradox. It is a sort of a tension, a normative tension, right? How do you react when I tell you that we, the philosophy department of the University of Vienna, intend it, but it's utterly bad? You're gonna think a bit strangely about me and us, because you're gonna say, well, Bernhard, obviously you haven't sorted it out with your colleagues, right? You should sort it out. If you think it's utterly bad, you should either convince the others or let yourself be convinced by them. So even though it's not a paradox, there is still a normative tension in attitudes of the form, it is utterly bad, but we intend it. It's a pressure, normative pressure towards joint deliberation. So, meaning that even though plural attitudes are not constitutively under the guise of the good, they are normatively under the guise of the good. Because I ought to sort it out with my colleagues. I ought to ensure that that our intentions are under the guise of the good. Now they are not under the guise of the good because I'm saying, well, it's utterly bad. But I should sort it out. I should engage in deliberation and see to it that what we intend is under the guise of the good, right? So there's still, you know, this guise of the good is still operating on plural intentions, even though it's not operating in the very same way as it is in the singular case. But we have what we want. We wanted the guise of the good placed on intention. And we have it in the plural case too, in virtue of self-knowledge. And we have it in the plural case too, even though in a bit of a different way. Okay, let's admit it, it's a weaker way. It's weaker than in the singular case. But it gives us hope for political, you know, thinking about mind and politics and all of that stuff. And it also is a research perspective, by the way. It's highly promising. Again, the shoemaker thing, which I'm going to skip. Here is the self-authorization issue. We said that whereas I intend puts me in a position of authority to tell you what it is I intend. The same does not work in we intend, because if I tell you what it is we, the philosophy department, intend, and you know that Rasko has been there and I've been away for a long time, you're probably going to turn to Rasko if you want to know what it is we intend, rather than to me, right? Now, is this really the way to go? I mean, I admit that it is way more frequent in plural cases for people not to know or to be mistaken about what it is they together intent than it is in the singular case. I admit that. But I would hold on to the idea that there is still something to be said for asking a member, being me, rather than a non-member, being Rastko. And I think I just want to refer to the practice in qualitative social research. When you want to know about a group's attitude, what do these people think? Viennese philosophers, what do they think? You're usually going to ask a member. Why is that? Is it just because that person is usually in a better position to observe what's going on there? Or isn't it rather because that member, qua member, is in a position of not making up our mind, but is in the business of making up a group's attitude? Right? Not in the autocratic sense, what it is I think is up to me. What it is we think is not up to me, but it is up to us. And I'm one of us. So I'm in the business of jointly making up what it is we intend. And this does not include outsiders. So that's why, rather than because these people are in the best position to observe, but because these people are in the business of making up what it is they believe and intend, that we favor in qualitative research members over non-members in terms of interview partners for qualitative research. Okay, so I argue that I haven't said anything about self-validation, but I argued that at least these three functions, self-identification, self-commitment, and self-authorization, can be found in the plural as well. And we need these features in order to get at the plural subject, the real one, not the emulated one, the real one. And we got it now. We have at least three of the four functions. So what about then this spooky thing? So who is this plural subject? I'm sure you have plenty of questions. When does it come about? And all sorts of questions. And I'll be happy to take them. But I want to address the big worry now. The we. Who is he? I'm assuming he is a he. Who is the we? Have you ever met the guy? Where can you reach him? What's he doing? I mean, what sort of entity is that somehow is between us, over our heads? Class consciousness, Volksgeist, conscience collective, all very weird and highly discredited notions, right? People thinking that there's something mental that's operating on individuals, right? And we don't like that, right? So let me try to alleviate all of these worries with an indirect move. So again, here is the worry. So in somewhat less emotional terms and more argumentative terms, so this is the worry of spookiness against the we. If you and I intend to fight together, it's not the case that the we, rather than you and I, intends to fight and pulls off the fighting, right? And there is no additional subject. If you and I go for a walk together, it's just the two of us out there, not three. It's not that there is a third subject somehow coming along with us. And there is nothing over and above our heads that is or has our intention, right? And what I want to say now is that you don't need the plural to have these worries. So if you and I intend to fight together, it's not the case that the we, rather than you and I, intends to fight and does the fighting. But that's the same problem in the singular. If I intend to fight, it's not the case that there is something of the sort of the I that does or has my intending. Otherwise, why should I care about what that I intends? I mean, have you ever met your I or somebody else's I? It's the same sort of gibberish, same sort of nonsense. But why do we do that or accept that as a real worry in the plural case when we think in the individual case, well, just gibberish? If you and I go for a walk together, it's not it's just the two of us out there, not three. It's not that there is a third subject somehow coming along with us, but it's the same in singular. If I intend to go for a walk alone, it's just me out there. There's no such thing as the I coming along with me. It would be a hassle if the I were constantly accompanying me on my walk. I want to be there alone, right? So let the I stay at home if it exists. So there's nothing over and above our heads that is or has our intention, but in the individual case too, there's no homunculus with or within me that has my intention. So, and you know, we've learned that part. We learned rather well, I think. Maybe we've gotten a bit loose in recent years, but such authors as, here is a list of good authors to read concerning the mistake concerning I. We know that from authors such as Hume, Fichte, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Wittgenstein, and countless others. So, and if we learn that lesson, and the basic lesson is, you know, the subject is not a substance that has intentions as properties. Rather, it is, I call it an adverbial feature of the mind. The subject is the way in which attitudes are subjective. It is not an entity that has intentions as properties. Don't reify the subject. It is an adverbial feature of attitudes. And if once you had this insight, and I think most philosophers had the insight in the individual case, they learned. But now when we're talking about the plural, they sort of forget this insight. They think, oh, the we, that's got to be the thing over and above and stuff. So, you know, the whole scenario of fear vanishes once you realize that when we're talking about plural subjects, we're talking about adverbial features of attitudes. That's it. We're not talking about that thing that has attitudes as properties. So, it's not spooky. And yeah, I guess I have exceeded my time anyway. And this is the last slide. I've got nothing more to say. I'm a bit shocked. I thought I would be going on for longer.
Thank you.
From existentialism, that is often in the abnormal case that the nature of things, if there is a nature, is revealed. So think about it and come back soon.
Sorry, just a second. Because for instance, my commitments and how I'm committed to ideas and how I act in order to reach some ideas are a lot of times this kind of mess, and not knowing what I'm doing kind of gives me, you know, the potential to, you know, find it. So, and that's where sometimes I get my agency from not knowing as well. So I or you know, from this kind of intuition that there might be something there, but but you know, it's not quite clear. We don't have to go there.
No, I think it's totally random, but I need a specific case so that we can see what it is you know about what it is you're doing and what you don't know. So a specific case, of course, the mind is a mess, right? We believe a lot of stuff that's not even consistent, and by the way, it's in virtue of our becoming aware of inconsistencies that they vanish. Again, a function of self-knowledge. It creates a bit of order in that total mess that's the mind. But I mean, it's very important for thinking about action to discuss it on specific cases so that we can see what's going on.
So I'm actually going to talk about your example, which is intriguing and modern, but it's also very troubling. Tango. And tango, as you know, historically comes from blacks, from Argentina. They invented it. and then it was thought out by different Portuguese voice writers, Carlos Verdaire, etc. The problem with tango is that it is everything but intention. It's passion, it's seduction, it's you know what you used to say, that it's a dance between equals and hopeful and joyfully sad thought that is dance. So in tango you always have the moment of improvisation, unpredictability, experience. So I don't see how there is intention in tango. I don't intend to dance. I'm always in the dance.
And can you come to this question about tango? This is one dimension of the example. There's another, and I think more troubling problem with this example, and this is that I'm not really sure that you can't have an individual intention to tango with Western. You can tango by yourself. That won't be a very good tango.
Okay.
But you can tango by yourself. Can you have an intention to have sex? Is this a collective intention? You can't have sex by yourself. Okay, you can.
Well, I'm a bit open to the possibility that.
So, but you can still have an individual intention to have sex without anybody else having the same intention. You can still have that intention and look for someone with the same intention.
Yes, that's a phenomenon. Yeah.
So I'm not convinced by this idea that there are collective intentions which are the conceptual and practical prerequisites for certain things such as tango.
Okay, yeah, maybe let me start with a confession. I've never ever in my life danced a tango. I don't know what I'm talking about. I thought it was something you're actually doing together. And I thought it was something that doesn't just happen to you, or that it wasn't something that happens out of uncontrollable passion. Like, I don't know, an outcry of fear. Like, an outcry of fear is something you do, but you do not do intentionally. It just, you know, it's passion that lets you, for horror, you shout, right? And I was under the impression that tango is not of that kind. I was aware that tango involves passion, but I thought that, you know, people actually wanted to do it. So, and that's enough for me, you know. A lot of emotion is intentional, it's fully intentional. And some emotions are even quite goal-directed, let me tell you that. Now, if tango is not a good example, just choose another one. As to, you invoked the view that, of course, I mean, I can intend to make it the case that we have sex. But the intention to make it the case, the object of that intention is the making it the case. And that's not the joint intentional making. It's not the same thing. You know, we want to explain the feature in virtue of which an action, a joint intention, a joint action, joint token action can be intentional. And it's got to be jointly intended, whether or not there is a background story that it came about because I intended to make it the case, that Rast when I, X, not tango, something else, that's a different question. It's not the answer to the question concerning the feature in virtue of which our acting, collective acting, is intentional. It's just a different topic.
Sex is a good example about the way in which, an example of the way in which we had this discussion yesterday at the seminar, in which what may appear as collective intention may be somebody else's intention, which is taken up by me, which you labeled yesterday as being the dubious, esoteric sort of view. And when I listen to you today, I think of Max Scheler constantly, because, you know, Scheler's account of love and sex is one of the most influential in European philosophy. He says the true love, as opposed to infatuation, is the fundamentally aesthetic appreciation of the other person's personality, right? But it goes together, it is inseparably coupled with the intention of the lover to consume the love through the sexual act. It is an individual intention to consume the love. So he makes fun of, you know, those accounts, Kierkegaardian accounts, you know, idealistic and platonic love. So it is an individual intention. Now, this is really connected to the projection of desire, to something that yesterday you labeled it as esoteric, and what started from yesterday was also question the existence of angels, which I
yeah, I was countering your.
Philosophically, the existence of angels is no more problematic than the existence of.
Okay, no, we can't continue yesterday's discussion here because there's a different audience. But let me say a word concerning love. I mean, I'm talking about joint intentional activities here, and if love is just me wanting to consume the object of my admiration, then it's obviously not a joint intentional activity, because just me wanting to basically eat you up, right? Then it's just not in the domain of the topic of this paper. So I mean, I hope there's the right analysis of love allows for different cases, but in any case, it's not in the ballpark of this paper.
Yeah, but the experiential analysis of the attitude towards sex, this is a good example, this is what I say. And it is well known that someone's intention to have sex with you may cause your own intention to have sex, may arouse you to have sex.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's. But that's still the background story. You know, I might want to have sex with you, but if sex is an intentional joint action, and that's not at all clear to me, because we've got to sort out the concept, the kind of action we have in mind here. And that's why I prefer what I take to be clear examples I took. Let's take a chess game as an example. I can want to play a game of chess with you, but I cannot intend our playing a game of chess, because intention is action referential and thereby action self-referential. I can intend only what in principle I can do. The subject of intention, subject of the intended action have to be the same. So if I want to play a game of chess with you, then I better ask you, and if you agree, we together may play a game of chess intentionally. And that's now the last thing, is the thing I want to analyze. So the background story is good, and I agree with you that often the recognition of a desire of another person arouses the same desire in the observing subject. I agree. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes we're disgusted at seeing what other people desire, but very often, yeah, there is a conformist sort of preference. Sometimes this puts us into opposition to each other. If I observe you wanting the water and I have the same desire for the water, we are in competition with each other, and not in a joint action, rather in a struggle. But sometimes this may facilitate cooperation. So we are talking now about factors that facilitate cooperation. But I want to, as a philosopher, I want to get clear about the intentionality that's involved, that the intentionality in virtue of which joint actions can be intentional. So that's the topic, and it's somewhat more narrow here. Even though I agree, I mean, I have my reservations concerning Scheler's concept of emotional identification. But otherwise, I agree that all of these mechanisms are very important for social theory and so on. It's just that here the topic is a bit. Here, I mean, if you like Scheler, he has these remarks which are very puzzling, where he says, and I always thought he was right, and much of what I did in the last 15 years was an attempt to make this clear and acceptable. He says in the analysis of immediate co-feeling that there is one token act of consciousness in which many, in his case, two people participate. One token attitude, many participants. Now this strikes most authors as utterly weird, because, you know, mind has to be individuated according to individual bodies. So, you know, you won, so you've got an attitude, and this cannot be the same attitude in terms of numerical identity, not in terms of qualitative identity. Distribution is not a problem, but collection is a problem. And Scheler has that claim, and I want to defend that claim. And here is a proposal, an attempt to defend that claim. So I'm sympathetic to Scheler.
It's actually been proven empirically, so whatever philosophers consider this weird, simply don't know that it has been proven. Martin Hoffman has conducted research which shows that you can actually take on the attitudes of others thinking that they are your own attitudes. And he did research with children. We can talk about that later. But this has actually been empirically proven in psychology.
Yeah, but you may still think that whether, I mean, there is a psychopathology where people think that even their bodily feelings are other persons. And there is this debate whether we have here a case of misidentified subject. And other authors, in my impression is that those authors are right to say that even in these cases, the attitude self-identifies because it's your feeling that you take to be another person's. It's not another person's feeling that you take to be another person's. You know, this is Gallagher thing about these psychopathological cases.
Scheler, sex, and everything, if the only real example of the joint intention that we're talking about is basically the prostitution situation, where there is an intention that I want sex, female or male, minds, and there is another one who can provide me with the same or the different intentionality, but it's somehow in line with each other. So the two intentions can be made to match. Well, I will use this example. I would like to hear what you think of that, but I will use this example to a little bit try to also extend the discussion that we had, because you mentioned the term agency only once you finished your lecture, and I wondered if you lack agency in the sense of the society or the broader system of relationship that also imprints or impacts on how we intend, so the mode and who are we also as well, the subject, and also then to what the five thing, so what we want to produce together as a we. Because somehow, I mean, I love the conclusion with the we subject is not speaking, of course, but in the end, I somehow miss this kind of what's the power relation, which we can term society or which we can term in other ways as well. Where is this component in the mode subject? And what was the last one? Sorry.
Yeah, concerning power, I'm of course impressed with Hannah Arendt's analysis, heavily Aristotelian analysis, distinction between power and violence, where power is based on joint acceptance and arises out of the cooperative public spiritedness of the participants. And I think here are tools to understand how our being plural subjects provides the possibility or constitutes the possibility of legitimate power, right? If it's collectively accepted, it's power, not violence. So that's one suggestion. But concerning sex, having thought about it for a couple of seconds at least, my intuition would be, well, you know, this is really something of which there are so widely different conceptions that it's very difficult to talk about it. So sex, everybody has his or her own conception in mind, his or her own preferred practice, and it would be, it is very difficult to discuss any form of action or intentionality where conceptions differ so widely. So that doesn't make it a suitable example for discussion. Because whatever conception of sex you take as an example, there's always going to be somebody with a different inclination, right? So this is just a bit too vague for my thing. Now the power thing, that's certainly, I do believe that in order to account for Arendt's, if power is not just to be violence, if that is a legitimate or a useful distinction between power and violence, where there is good power, maybe not everybody agrees, because some people might think that power is a bad thing. When it can be a good thing because it is sort of authoritative and it comes with legitimacy, I think ultimately in the last resort any analysis must use some such conception where it really stands for, you know, where its role is really the exertion of what we want, we together. And it is very important to understand that this is plural. This is also an idea which I think Hannah Arendt really had in mind when she emphasized the plurality. And that's a thing that goes through the history of political thought. How can we understand unification between people? And there is always this skeptical line that says, well, you know, unification is just submission. As you can read in Aristotle's Politics, where he says that every koinonia has a governing part and a submissive part, right? Don't like that. We would like to have egalitarian forms of unification. And then there are these ideas where unification is just the creation of a collective singular, such as in Plato, with the analogy between the individual soul and the state. So the soul is sort of the model on which the state is analyzed. And that I think is deeply mistaken. And Aristotle is quite right in saying, well, this is reading too much unity in the plural. The plural is plural, it's not singular. So if there is plural unity, it cannot be a singular. But then he had this thing about, you know, hierarchy. Aristotle had this hierarchy obsession, where there's always got to be one guy, man, who wears the trousers and dominates the koinonia. And I guess we have to move beyond that. One way of reconstructing koinonia in an Aristotelian way would be to say, and of course Hegel has this story and so on. One way would be to say, well, you know, what Aristotle calls the dominating part is in reality the principle of unity. So, for example, if we go for a walk together, there is this idea of going for a walk together. And that's what Aristotle calls the dominating part. It's not that Rastko has to be the guy in charge and me just going along. That's not how we're going for a walk together. But we are our action is under the principle of our going for a walk together. And that's the dominating part. It's not a guy, it's not an individual. Rather, it is the prohieresis katalogon, the guiding spirit, so to say. Am I addressing your issues? Or?
Well, in a way, yes. But I'm still thinking about how I'm thinking how societal forces are also in adversity without our willingness to submit to them. How they are structuring our intentions, so our will, but also how they are structuring ourselves as the subjects, who are entering in some kind of communication, who are entering in some agreement together, intending together. I have no, of course, I have no answer. I'm just curious, and also where is the notion of agency in that? is the notion of agency in our acting together, or is it the notion of agency in my being agent, so in my own intention? So that's something that's
I want to say, with regards to the anonymous or impersonal way in which often societal forces operate, I would say that they usually depend on our going on with the scheme. So, of course, we're under all sorts of pressures. You know, the organizational structure that leads to the institutional arrangement that leads, as a non-intended consequence, leads to effects that are operative, to which we then adapt. So, sort of, you know. And the cure for it is joint deliberation. Now, that's just as individual case, you start something and then you don't think about, you know, you don't reconsider your plan, you just stick to your plan and you get in all sorts of mayhem. And this is more dramatic in the plural case where we just go along with it and we don't deliberate on how we're going to live together. There's got to be joint deliberation, because what we do together, societies are the forms, are the ways in which we live together. Institutions are forms, are specifications of contributions to the joint action of living together. So living together is something we do. That's a joint intentional action. We do it intentionally. We live together intentionally. And we do it in certain ways. And we have constant difficulty of making sure that the way we live together is the way we want. So, because it's very difficult to, you know, deliberate and talk to each other. It's extremely difficult. But we should make sure that the way we live together, our institutional arrangements, that they conform, that they serve the purpose as tools for our living together, and that this living together is in accordance to what we want. So this is the Rousseauian basic setting of how I think about it.
But living together is not a collective intention. It would have been a collective intention if we had the choice to live together or not to live together. This is the classic mistake inherent in the social contract theory at the political level. You don't have a choice. It's just a retroactively projected theory. You live together. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, but it's not that every action is voluntary. It's not. That seems to. I mean, of course, we liberal Democrats, we want it all to be voluntary, right? But maybe even in action, you know, you do all sorts of things concerning which you don't really have choice. But this doesn't mean it's not intentional. So this is, and I would say living together is not a joint intention, it is a joint action, and it is jointly intentional. And Aristotle, by the way, just to go on a little bit on that tangent, has this notion of action being intentional in virtue of its being self-known. And in the collective case, it's one of the many meanings of the word aesthesis in Aristotle. And in the case of living together, sytzen, it is synaesthesis, and it becomes later, through translations, it becomes the word common sense. It is quite interesting for the topic of collective intention. Actually, you know, etymologically, common sense comes from an analysis, from the Aristotelian analysis of the feature and virtue of which our living together is joint activity. So koinonia clearly in Aristotle is joint activity. It's for some good. So that there is, I really advise, I recommend Aristotle as an author to read in that context. And it also connects nicely, of course, to Arendt's thought, Arendt's rather positive thought about violence, about power. And I realized that the thing you have in mind is more like where power isn't such a good thing, right? Where power...
Not necessarily. I thought it in holding. I thought of power in holding. In terms of, you know, power is everywhere. It's productive. It's also negative, but also productive. So in that sense, we're simply imbued by power as an individual or as acting as subject, as which we chose and others which we didn't, like Russia.
Yeah.
But let me
just one quick deep word on the way in which subjects relate to power. I do think it is a mistake to think that subjects are constituted by power. A subject is what it is in virtue of itself. It is not produced by anything but itself. It is self-constituted. It is autopoietic, if you prefer the word. So it is under all sorts of constraints, but it is never produced by anything. And that's why it is so difficult to explain it, because you cannot give an explanation that identifies producing factors, because it's not produced by anything, but it's self-constituted. So that's, I think that's the insight. That's often difficult in discussions with more naturalist philosophers in the current debate, because we're really talking about something that's fundamental, and of which I want to claim it cannot be explained in that usual way. But then again, this German thing, German idealism, that's very helpful, because these guys really believe in it. Unfortunately, they made way too much out of it. But this idea, to me, seems to be very strong in German idealism, and also in phenomenology, of course. Phenomenology is very good in understanding the basic nature of subjectivity.
Thank you for this final lecture. I just have two short questions. First, you said at the start of your lecture, the importance of rules, common sense. This is something that is intrinsically intersubjective. So in a sense, when you refer to some rules, but can you collectively intend to improvise? That's something that goes along with, but not just how do you modify? When you start modifying the rules, can that be collectively done? And if it is, how do we attain the same level of intersubjectivity? Because it seems, at least intuitively, that we must have at that point a lower level of intersubjectivity when we have modification within the rules. And the other question refers to me. How do you comment, and how does this your account of we intentionality refers to his distinction between the I and the me, where the me is constituted by the collective other and all of that stuff?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. So the reason why I'm not using even the word intersubjective is because it is connected to authors who thought that we can conceive of sociality in terms of mutual attitudes between individuals. So of me thinking about you, thinking about me. Some reciprocal stuff going on between subjects. So the idea there is that subjectivity is singular, but these monads, they somehow mirror each other. And that's sociality. I think this is wrong. It is wrong because the way in which we are social is in terms of plural subjects. Now, plural subjects, when we are plural subject, I stand in an I-thou relation to you, but I'm not looking at you, I'm looking at the goal we're jointly pursuing, right? It's not a structure of mutual attitudes that constitutes the plural subject, but rather an awareness of the goal as ours. And that then enables specific types of mutual relations. So it's more fundamental. So that's also, you had Dan Zahavi, right? He doesn't buy that point, right? He has his difficulty, but he's getting closer, right? With every paper, he's getting closer. And eventually, he's gonna see the light. Now with Mead, Mead has this. Many authors have this idea that the self is socially constructed. It is in virtue of my parents addressing me that I am. And this is, I think, wrong because, and Mead, if you read him carefully, I think, acknowledges that because there's got to be something that allows an individual to recognize another person's attitude as directing to him or her. So it's already got to have a sense of him or herself in order to be even able to recognize that now that other person is referring to him. So that mirroring thing, taking another person's attitude, that presupposes self-awareness. Unfortunately, Mead does not say much about self-awareness. He presupposes it, but he does not elaborate on it. So I think a lot of what he says is right. I do care about what others think of myself, and I'm conforming to these, structures of mutual expectations. But, the basis of the thing is self-awareness, and that's simply not analyzed. And many authors who picked up on symbolic interactionism, like Habermas, thought that actually this theory does away with that basic self-awareness claim. And that's simply misreading. In my view, Habermas misread Mead, because Mead does not claim that the subject is socially constructed.
We're out of time.
Great discussion. Thank you very much for your questions and objections.